and welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, please be sure and check out our previous episodes. This episode, we will continue our discussion on Everything Begins and Ends at the Kentucky Club by Ben Saenz. My name is Vanessa, and this is Literally Literary, which is brought to you by the Mellon Foundation through the Humanities Collaborative at EPCC and UTEP.
Welcome back, everyone. Last time we were talking about Ben's book and the setting and some of the themes, and started talking a little bit about the first story. We didn't touch too much on it, and especially when it comes to the religious angle, or rather what it has to say about religion. And so if it's all right with you guys, I wanted to start with the passage on 32, the funeral scene. And funerals are one of the common settings along with the Kentucky Club in this collection. And I think Ben is really trying to get at how we all process death and trauma, and the rituals, I think, is another important thing that we didn't mention last time. What is the meaning of a ritual? What is it tied to? What's the value and symbolism behind it? So in the first story, he has gone to be with a woman. The passage reads, "The funeral was at the cathedral where his uncle had attended Mass for over 50 years. He had married his wife there, had baptized his children there, had marked and measured his life in that sacred building. It did not matter that neither Javier nor I were believers. How could we believe in a church that did not believe in us, either separately or together? Still, that church and its rituals were a part of us. Our bodies, if not our hearts, were familiar with the medieval chants. There was a strange and intimate comfort there." This passage, Strongline, really struck me because of, they're able to look beyond their own atheism and still find a sense of belonging in this kind of place. And obviously, of course, it's a mournful occasion, but the fact that they're both homosexual, and that under Roman Catholicism, that's one of the big taboos, I think is worth underlining. And as it says there, there's that emphasis there on rituals, right? And despite the fact that they don't belong there under the Holy Father, they still feel, because of the rituals, that it's inextricable, right? That they're going to be part of it no matter what, even if they are rejected and isolated because of it. And I think that says a lot about the complicated relationships we all have to religiosity and the sense of communion that comes from these kinds of gatherings, church, and in particular the cathedral, right, which is kind of it's a grand building and here in El Paso and downtown. And I think it also says a lot about how they've already in some ways have evolved to beyond a pettiness that they can have toward, because it's very easy, I think, to reject the relationship to the religion altogether if they're not believers. But it says a lot about their humility and their virtue, that that they look beyond that kind of pettiness. Well, actually, I don't even know if petty is maybe not the right word, because it says a lot to be rejected by what you are, your sexual orientation.
Well, yeah, he acknowledges it. So there's that aspect. I think it also kind of points to just how intertwined religion is as part of the culture here on the border. Mm-hmm. Even if you're not religious, I think a lot of us have grown up with that, being raised Catholic or whatever. And that's why I think with going to church service, same in my own experience, right? The same way, it's a great way of describing it, a strange and intimate comfort. It does remind me of going to mass and going through the different stages from, to confirmation. And even though I'm not as involved, church funerals still happen, and that's brings me back to the church, and in a very similar sense, thinking about this kind of comfort. But here we are, and still kind of remembering some of the prayers, like the movements, the ritual of it all,
Shaking hands and all that.
saying your grace, yeah, that's very much still pretty prevalent here in the cities.
And I think the fact that the rituals, I think to me, the way I interpret that, I don't know what you guys think, is that Ben is trying to say that, well, the narrator, I should say, is trying to say that rituals are universal, that even if you yourself are an atheist, when it comes to rituals, as long as you partake of it, you don't have to believe because they don't, right? And they still find that solace in that moment. Because of the ritual. And I think to me, I wish I could ask him if he was here. But, I think Ben is trying to say that this is what makes us human. Homo sapiens is that we have rituals, unlike other species that, they communicate and they're intelligent too. But I think rituals is really what makes us unique as human beings. That's why I find this a really strong moment for the opening story.
Yeah, and actually in this moment in a book that's filled with tragedy and death and trauma, pain, hurt, rage, this is a moment of solace, like you said, the ritual, the way it brings us together, and it kind of leads to this moment of love, right? Where Carlos, right, realizes he's in love with Javier when he's sobbing. How do you say it? I could feel my heart leaping towards him in the same way that a believer's heart might leap towards the face of God. I actually mentioned that in the previous episode. Now that I'm reading it out loud. But I mean, I think that what that kind of leads to is this throughout the book, and in here, of course, as well in this particular story, Ben starts to question what it means to be a man and masculinity. We'll leave that open because I know other stories bring that up as well.
Yeah,
but.
And that the mourners, as a ritual, right, as a funeral, I mean, I'm sure, of course, you all have been to one, but, funerals, this kind of funeral is unique in that they're actually there more for Javier than his uncle. And, I think that shows the influence that he has in his community amongst his friends and it's that kind of occasion where he end up getting more attention, and because they know that it's they want to be there for him. So to me, that was the standout moment of the first story. I don't know if you guys had any other ones from the first one before we dive into the second one, which is Art of Translation.
I had a paragraph on 34 that I really, really liked. It's the second one, where he's talking about not really analyzing each other. They just learn to read each other with their actions and how they...
Sorry. Doesn't help. I highlighted that one as well.
Yeah, that one. I really like that one because I'm not very much a person that's going to ask you your favorite things. I'm going to learn about these favorite things through your actions and what you tell me. So I really like that one. So it says, we tried to learn about each other without explaining ourselves too much. We became each other's favorite books. We were obsessed with reading each other. And so I felt like that was really strong and like a really beautiful way to describe that.
How do you think then that relationship develops for them too? Considering one of the main, well, I would say possibly the main conflict in the story, at least to me, is that Javier still has that attachment to Juarez, and there's that line about is his love for Juarez outweigh?
That was actually one of my strong lines.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, go for it.
page 36. Right, it's actually at the end of a section, and that's I highlighted for that very reason. He writes, "I was not his only love and never would be. Perhaps he loved Wadis more than he loved me, but he was right about me. I was not a jealous man. He could love his Wadis, and he could love me too. That was the way it would be. We can live this way forever," I said. It was more heaven than I deserved. That's a strong note upon their relationship, and one of the things that it draws here is the parallels of the two cities again, and I think Carlos's depiction of it, where I think he shows genuine concern for Javier, and he wants him to move to El Paso, but obviously he can't do that because his life is there. And there's a lot of, in many ways, maybe privilege in being able to just uproot yourself and your family and to just move cities. And that you see that in Javier where he can't just leave. And that through that little love relationship, you can get kind of the bigger sense, of how rooted we are.
Yeah, and I also had that passage labeled, and I put in love is also the way that we conceive of love. There's different versions of love in these collections, and to me, I see that as like, even though of course it's a city that he's in love with, like it's a form of non-monogamy if you think about it, because he's able to accept that that Javier is going to have that attachment to Juarez regardless, and that he's not going to be able to change his mind about it, but he's still willing to accept them because of it, or rather despite it.
Yeah.
So I think it also shows, his both of their, I think, his maturity, and being able to just accept that, because I think it does take a lot of someone to be able to accept that someone is always going to have that attachment that is injurious to them and the relationship, as we come to find, of course, with what happens. Vanessa, did you have any thoughts on how that relationship ends up developing?
Well, with like that passage too, I think it's important to like realize that they're like, he's able to compromise. Like he's not gonna be like, it's me or Juarez type of thing. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't understand. Like
I don't even think that ever works in any relationship either.
Yeah.
Or it's kind of almost
it's kind of like a toxic
death
thing.
relationship. Yeah.
Yeah. But so like to see it written down here and not represented in that toxic way, I think that was really good.
Yeah, it's a nice representation of love there.
Yeah. This is always a hard book for me to read again. A collection, because of course, as you mentioned, right, it's just rife with tragedy. And, as beautiful as their love is, and it blossoms, like a rose, of course, it doesn't end well for Javier. And so the scene on page 40, I think, is important too, because, it says here, he's finding out, after the fact, for Magda, some men, they had rifles, or maybe not rifles, weapons. We heard them. It wasn't dark yet. They were dragging Javier out into the streets. They were rounding up all the men from the neighborhood. They must have been looking for someone in particular, so they took him all. And so, it's what we call this in Juarez. When this was happening, we call them like levantones, where you could be just in a stoplight and they all of a sudden cut you off, and they got guns or whatever, and so you have to comply. And so this is what ends up happening to him, and it's left unexplained why this happens. It seems like this is just wrong place, wrong time kind of thing. But I think it's also fair to speculate that, as we had, I think, talked about outside the recording, that maybe he was taken because of his homosexuality. And this was he was targeted because of it, because there's a lot of homophobia in Mexico as there is in the US. And so after this, he, Juan Carlos, of course, looks everywhere. He finds no answers. No one is able to tell him, not newspapers, lawyers, human rights activists, not Congress. And he asks, I thought of looking in the desert, but where in the desert would I look?
Yeah.
And ultimately, he has to find closure with that. I think that's another of the big ideas in this collection is, on 43, where we get, of course, the titular line of the first story, which is, he has gone to be with the woman, with all the nameless women who have been buried in the desert. I nodded and thought, he has gone to be with his mother. And so this is how that first one ends, where the desert really, as a setting as well, here in this first one at least, is a place where unimaginable crimes have been committed against women through femicides. And in this case, for Javier, because of the drug war violence, and also because of corruption in some cases, he's just another one there who ends up buried in that desert. And, many, of course, to this day, I think, haven't even been found. There's a lot of missing.
Yeah, there's a lot of hopelessness in that too. Talking about where would I even look in the desert, and also talking to people, speaking of the corruption, talking to the police, to anyone, and not not being heard. He said it felt like being invisible. So I mean that. Speaking of the desert, I think that really again ties in several, including the next story, right? The Utter Translation. I know our main character has his own kind of relationship with the desert. Right. So what do you want to say about that one?
So the second story, Utter Translation, to me also jumps out because of what's currently going on. And so I think in some ways it's prescient, because we mentioned this book was published back in 2012. And so there's a passage on page 52 where, all we know so far is that Nick was jumped. And here, though, there's, the reporters that come in, right? And so the press does have a role here. And, so in the italicized portion of that, to me, it just seems like these are questions that are being asked by the people, right? And the press that they want answered. And so it's more victim blaming. And I think we've talked about that before. But the questions are, wasn't it true that the boy had done something to those other boys? He must have provoked them, goaded them into attacking him. Surely the boys must have had a reason. Couldn't it be true that the boy wanted to start some kind of race war? Did the boy have papers? What was an illegal doing at a public university? And so even nowadays, well, especially I think nowadays, we have a lot of hatred towards undocumented immigrants, in this case, a student. And this is also a story that's set in the 80s and in Albuquerque. So I think as a setting, it's one of those stories where you look back, 1985, that's a year that I was born, right? And to think that something like this happened back then, this kind of hate crime, right, which it clearly was, is not something that I ever conceived of back then. I do conceive of it now, but I think it's interesting, and I wonder why Ben chose to kind of look 30 years ago to write about the story of Nick in this kind of way in Albuquerque, of all places. I mean, one answer to that would be, well, Albuquerque is a white majority city. But the idea that he's targeted simply because he looks someone who could be undocumented, right, is another reason why. To me, this is a very important story to tell. How the press all of a sudden, like we talked about with Black Lives Matters, right? They start blaming the victim and assuming things about the victim, that they provoked, that he provoked them.
Why did he want to start a race war? And I think his sister handled it quite perfectly, right? That's actually on the previous page when there's reporters at their house, and the mother is upset, but it's his sister Angela that runs out and grabs the reporter's microphone and just throws it, and you do see a lot of rage, not misplaced, I would say either. How did she say it? Let's go 49. No, 50.
51?
Yeah, 51. She says, like kind of towards the middle of the page, that paragraph. He says, I stood in quiet awe of my sister Angela, who stormed out into the yard, grabbed the reporter's microphone, looked into the camera, and yelled, someone used my brother's back like a goddamn chalkboard. You want to know what they wrote on his back? Is that what you want? You want to know how we feel? We fucking feel like dancing. She tossed the microphone into the neighbor's yard and stared at them until they drove away. I think that's quite appropriately placed rage. There's a lot of that in these stories, but here you kind of see that, and also I think it never even says what they write on his back, right? But I think, even like at the end of this section, kind of in the middle, nice use of white space, he's always been obsessed with language, but now he's kind of like it's falling apart from him, and so he looks up the word illegal, which makes me think maybe that might be what was written. It's never said, but
yeah, or some other slur.
Yeah. And I guess that's kind of like almost like the horror trope of instead of like revealing the monster, it leaves it up to the imagination. It could be like any of these.
Yeah. And the three white boys themselves, I mean, it kind of reminded me a little bit of Sonny's Blues because of how that trauma that Nick is trying to process, ultimately, they become a kind of nebulous, force, right? Like they don't have names and they just happen to be the representing hate. And on 55, his hate that he feels towards them, right? And it's kind of like, of course, totally justified, like you were saying, the rage that his sister also felt. It says, their hate sat inside me like a bird who was nesting, waiting for her eggs to hatch. And I don't know if y'all noticed, but there was other bird symbolism in the collection throughout, I think, that was represented different ways. And brother in our language is another one. But to me that's what kind of stood out about this second one is the incident itself and how the press kind of right away jumps at it, and ultimately I think how he's able to process the scars. The scars on his back is obviously something he's very sensitive about. Vanessa, was there a line from this one that stood out to you?
So I noticed that this one talks about the meaning of his last name. And I like the meanings of names, so we're going to talk about that some more.
Yeah.
So his last name is Guerra, which means war. And so on page 46, he kind of questions that meaning a little bit. So it says, and wasn't their last name Guerra? And didn't that name mean war? And didn't that mean that they were born to fight? But being born to fight did not mean that they were born to win the battles they fought. And so I really like that paragraph because he's kind of like, this is what my name means, but that doesn't always mean I'm going to win every battle.
Yeah, I think it has a nice bookend to it, and he's like you had mentioned as well, Richie, that he's fascinated with language and, he's always looking up words, right? And so his name in particular, of course, is ironic, right? And yet on I don't know if I'm jumping ahead here, but on 66 at the end, it kind of comes full circle. And this is how I interpret this one, where it's his way of processing this hate crime that has occurred. And it says, I told myself that the scars on my back had always been there. They were nothing more than birthmarks. I thought of that night. And he goes on, what I should have done when they were holding me down, I should have looked at my attackers and told them I had been waiting for them. I should have looked them all in the eyes and told them I knew their hate, understood it, embraced its awful necessity. I should have offered up my body as a sacrifice to their cruel and hungry gods. It was a war, after all, and sacrifices were necessary in a war, though I had never acknowledged that the war existed. War, guerra, that was me. That was my name. I like how this is, to me, he's puts himself as a scapegoat. And then also there's this idea that he's kind of remaking his own self, his body, the way that he is now thinking of the scars there, right, are not as like a symbol of hate, but rather as something that has always been there, that he was born with. And I think to me that this speaks to the human condition, right, that we are meant to suffer and there's no way going around it. As he says, what really stands out from that whole paragraph is it's awful necessity. I think to me this is a moment where Ben is kind of telling us about life itself, right? I mean, you had mentioned, Richie, as well, that there's a lot of moments in the text where it's the cosmic perspective of it all.
Yeah, Ben definitely does that. He has these lines, and even though you kind of fast forwarded to the end of that, this is what he should have done. I think it, something that Ben does throughout in his other stories is talk about the desert, right? We've already mentioned that for the previous story.
Yeah.
But on page 56, he's talking about how he sees the desert now. When he's running and he imagines the boys now living in the desert. How does he say it? I walked past all the homes and stood at the edge of the desert. I looked at the mesquites and chamisos and the cacti. They always caught me there in the dream, caught me in the desert. They lived there, those boys, the three of them, the white boys who had hurt me. They lived in all the deserts of the earth, death. That was the new word for desert. So that's where they lived now, in every desert and every dream I would ever have. I knew they would find me someday, catch me, cut me up again. I turned my back on the desert, and I once loved and ran home. So that's kind of thinking about, I was tying that passage into the previous one when we were talking about Juan Carlos going out to the desert trying to find, and just kind of what death is, just this kind of like fact of life, right? Here I'm drawing this parallel to death, but accepting it in a way, right? At the end.
Yeah, in the end. And I think, that just, again, the trauma and how he ties it into the desert, and it's about making sense of something that in some ways is senseless, right? It's this kind of hatred that he's very sensitive as a male boy, as a boy, and even his mom, right, regards that, no se te quita lo bonito, which to me, I found, just speaking to his sensitivity and his role in the family. Angela, you had mentioned, is much more aggressive, right, and rightfully so, of course, in that moment. But I think even with Sylvia, right, where he doesn't want to show those scars to her, speaks to how Ben is, really interrogating what is masculinity, right? What does it mean to be a man?
But that's a hardcore vulnerability that he's not ready for.
Yeah.
Because he's still trying to figure it out himself, essentially.
Yeah.
It's a good one. So the third story, that's your story, man.
Yeah, this is my sopa de fideo right here. I always like this story, not because it presents a sympathetic view of, someone who is a connect with the drug dealers, drug cartels, but rather because it's a beautiful story about a father and son. And I personally relate a lot to this kind of father, like the whole tough love thing. That's how I was raised, and I think a lot of Mexican boys were raised like this. I mean, I don't want to, make a big generalization, but I think it's common for fathers in Mexican families to be this kind of way. And so this is a story where a boy moves in with his dad after having been living with his mother in Juarez. So he moves to El Paso. He goes to Cathedral. And his father, he doesn't know much about him, but his father right away makes him, well, doesn't actually make him, but, has some ground rules. And our character here is the kind of protagonist who is very responsible, even though Max is kind of just dumped here by force because of his mother's situation, who it's alluded to his mother is a prostitute, a sex worker, I should say. And that's how, he was conceived. So to escape that kind of environment, he's taken to his father. And so it's a lot for him to adjust, a big adjustment. But I like how the relationship develops after he becomes someone who writes down these rules. And the rules themselves, pretty typical rules of someone who's, growing up in a household that the father or the parent wants him to do well. This is, of course, very ironic because his father, of course, he ultimately finds out, as I had mentioned, it isn't like some kind of white knight, right? I mean, he's someone who, does this dirty business, launders money. And, but the rules themselves on 79, they're 5 at first. And then this is the whole idea of him being the rule follower is make straight A's, clean the bathroom, the kitchen, go to church on Sundays, despite the fact that he mentions his father is not religious, or at least doesn't go to church. Never go into his room and don't lose the key. And so from that, he builds, this budding relationship where his father is very elusive and evasive, and there's not that much bonding that goes on between them, because I think his father, and this is what really gets me about this story, is like he wants him to protect them. But the irony is, if y'all have seen Breaking Bad, just like Walter White, that if you get in a circle, you're going to be, you could become targeted, by the cartels. And so it's the dramatic irony that he's unable to tell his son, because if he does, right, it's the idea of the curse of knowledge that comes from that. But there's a really touching moment where, his father beats the hell out of him because he tried drugs, right? And it really shows the kind of father he was. And of course, it's very hypocritical, right?
Well, where did he get these drugs? Where did he have access to them, right?
Yeah.
At their house.
Yeah. And that was the whole one of the rules, right? But, despite all that, that doesn't excuse the domestic violence. But, after that, on page 98, they end up making up, right? And so there's this moment where his father tells him here on 98, he said, as he handed me a beer, have a beer with your old man. And so to me, this is that moment where, it's just sharing a beer together, a drink together, right? That clearly shows how his father now sees him as someone who has grown into a man, and someone who he can talk to openly to some degree, and it goes from there, because after that, they kind of start joking more about drinking and things like that. But it's also he is able to mold his son into someone who is unlike him, because he ends up going to Georgetown, which is a Jesuit university that I've seen, and it's in person, and it's a beautiful university there in Washington, D.C. And yet his father, on his part, things don't end well for him. But my passage was at the very end, so I don't know if you guys had a one before that.
I like the idea of worrying as a sickness that he kind of describes it as. I'm trying to find it.
You mean for Max?
Okay, on page 87. I think this is the second time they talk on it. But I thought, oh. So this one is kind of like how he goes more in depth of it. It says, he didn't come back for a few days, but by then he had gotten me a cell phone so I could call or text him if I got too worried. He said people who were worriers never changed. You can't help it, he said. He made it sound like worrying was a sickness. And so I really liked that one because it kind of is, not really, but kind of, in the sense that once you start worrying, you don't stop until you know that everything's okay. And he kind of just wonders where his dad goes, and he wants to make sure that he's okay.
Yeah, there was that's actually interesting. That's why they end up fighting. Is his worry for his father becomes bad because even though his father early on is more selling, and later towards the end he starts using, and that's that he recognizes that, and that's when they have this moment where he tries to express his interest, and his father says, you haven't earned that right yet, punches him, right? And obviously that doesn't really change much because his father does end up withering away to his death.
Yeah. And it's also a role reversal, right? Because of course, the boy here, right, shouldn't be worrying about his father, right?
Yeah.
It should be the other way around. And so it does kind of show, I see this story as representing an evolution for Nick, for Max, of someone who is the rule follower and ultimately becomes the rule maker because of how, those, the tables turn, right? It's like Obi-Wan and Darth Vader, right? The learner becomes the master kind of thing. Richie, was there another one that you wanted to highlight from this one?
Yeah, but even when you were just saying it, that reminded me also with the whole texting thing, when his father would disappear, worry him, and he would just text back, "I like women," in this very and I kind of laughed at it. It was a dark moment, but when he kind of disappeared for a while, and his dad was trying to get hold of him, and he said the same thing, "I like women," and that was kind of him giving a taste of his own medicine, but kind of being cheeky, kind of I think made him laugh a little. But the one thing that actually did resonate with me is, again, thinking how everything's connected. He's riding the bus. This is it starts on page 90 when they're talking about the violence in Juarez, but it goes into 91. And he just kind of goes through these thoughts here, and thinking about the complacency of just this drug culture and its tie into the violence. And so at the top of page 90, sorry, I totally said that wrong. Yeah, page 90. I drifted away from their conversations. Again, this is women talking about the violence in Juarez. wondering what it would be like to take a gun to someone's head, to kidnap someone, to torture a man. What would it be like to cut someone's hands off? I knew there was a listserv that counted the bodies because I had joined that listserv. It was all about the dead bodies. The thing was that the bodies didn't have names. Sometimes I made up names for them. I had a whole list of names. This whole thing, I thought, this whole thing was because of men like my father. And so, as I'm reading all these stories, I'm just thinking of like the threads and the connections and the larger themes. And that's one thing is sometimes how this is all connected, the drug war, the war on drugs, all this, and people's involvement. From Sellers, the culture he grew up in here.
And he is a connect, right? So
Yeah.
there's that almost literal connection. It's why I think this story is so interesting, because he has to reconcile the love for his dad with what his father really is, behind that curtain. And ultimately that downfall, right, you mentioned, right, that his father undergoes, the de-evolution, where he ultimately does become addicted, right, and he's unable to escape that by that addiction. So kind of fast forwarding, if you guys didn't have any other passages, is the ending. So eventually Max is as I mentioned in Georgetown, and so in section 24 of this story on 100, he says, "I'm packing a few things and I'm going back home. He's on a respirator. He overdosed. Heroin, meth, I don't know. It all seems so predictable, so inevitable. His attorney called me. 'You need to come home and see your dad,' he said. 'I'm going back to take him off the respirator. I know that's what he would have wanted. At last, I can give him something that matters.'" And he goes on and says, "I'm holding the rosary he gave me for my first communion, the one that belonged to his father." And there's a lot of passing down, that occurs in this collection, right? Whether it's the watch in the first one, in this one it's a rosary. And I always told myself I didn't know my father. I sometimes told myself that I hated him. I always told myself that he didn't know me, but that wasn't true. It wasn't true at all. I knew him. I really knew him. "He punched me out once," I said, and then I laughed. "My father," I whispered. "His name was Eddie, not Edward, but Eddie. He was the man who saved my life. That's who he was." And that's how this story ends. And I thought it was very powerful how, and ultimately his father gave him rules, gave him a structure for life. He's well set in Georgetown, a prestigious university, and despite the fact that he was very much, of course, doing all these things, right? And it kind of I think it, like I mentioned, the connection to Breaking Bad, right? And we all know what happens. Well, if you guys have seen it, like what happens with Walter White and Heisenberg. But in this case, Eddie is clearly trying to provide for Max, and also at the same time keeping far away from that. And so that moment where he's on that respirator, and there's that idea that he saved my life because of the way he was tough on me and instilled the desire for getting educated. Literacy sponsor that we've talked about before, and he on that respirator, right, that is his gift that he gives him back, the gift of euthanasia, is the way I interpret it, that he's able to end his suffering. And the other reason I really connected to this story is not just because my father was, he wasn't an addict by any means, but he's very tough on me, and also a workaholic, which rubbed off on me a little bit. But he also ended it in he also died in a similar way. He was also he fell into a diabetic coma. And I remember to this day, happened about 7 years ago that I was at NMSU at the time, and I got a call, and I was gonna have a class, and so my brother was like, our dad's in my dad, he's brain dead. He just said it straight up. That's way my brother is. And so I remember, that 40-minute drive from, our drive, from Las Cruces all the way to Juarez was the longest drive of my life. Because I knew that I knew he was already hospitalized, but to know that, to realize that from one day to the next, he goes from being in a coma to just being just completely brain dead, and that they were gonna, pull the plug is what ultimately happened. Is the of course very tragic, but why I always, this story always hits me because of that.
Yeah, man. Thanks for sharing that. That's the thing that brings us together too in literature and art. And I think, that's one of the saving graces all throughout these compilations, is the things that save us. And he says at the end, right, this is the man who saved me. In other instances, it's books, it's TV. I think that's one of the things that's mentioned, the line from one of the stories, right? If it weren't for movies, they raised me, they saved me, and then it's books, it's art. You have all these characters that want to pursue art or study English or literature, and these are the things that connect us.
Yeah. I mean, and just like with Max, right? I mean, it's this idea of a father that my father, I think, was a complicated man, and but at the same time, just like Max's father, Eddie, he was also a provider, and so I think I relate a lot to that, and this idea that his suffering ended, even though I think there's a stubbornness there that you always kind of think back about. I think, and just like with Max, I also think bad about what could I have done, but it's like, what's the use in kind of that retrospect, when it is what it is, right? But yeah, I don't know if you guys related to anything else from this one, or maybe it was, fathers, I think, in this whole collection, right?
Fathers have an interesting place in the collection.
Yeah. And family, I think, in general. Was there anything else we wanted to plug?
Is there anything else you wanted to say, though?
On the last story?
Yeah.
It does remind me a little bit of my dad. The whole idea of rules, and you either have to do this or you're not going to have anything kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I think it really does shape you to be like a really strong person.
Tough love.
Yeah. And I don't know, it kind of, like the relationship that Max had with his dad, I think is similar to the one I have with my dad. Like, I don't see him a lot because we have opposite schedules. He'll be at work while I'm at home, or I'm at school, and then I go to work, and then I'm go to an event.
Yeah.
So we don't really see a lot of each other. But when we do, it's really good. And so, like, I felt like that was something that I could relate to into the story.
That's good, because I feel the same way, when my father was alive, is I feel I've work, I actually, it was more grad school, at the time when he was still alive, grad school, of course, Richie, like how, time consuming it is, and, you make a lot of sacrifices, and so, I had to move to El Paso as well, because just like in this book, the violence in Juarez became such that, in grad school, right, it's evening classes, right? So I would get out at 9, and I remember, running to try to catch the bus, because there was a time where I didn't have a car. And so I was taking a bus to Juarez, and, sometimes no one was there to pick me up because, like I said, we didn't have a car for some time. And so, I was walking home, and of course at that time, it was dangerous to be out at night in that way. And it was maybe like an hour-long walk from the bridge to my house, my parents' house, I should say. And yeah, there's those times where I think back to, I wish I could have just spent more time with them. And, he was a hard ass, just like Eddie was, but I think behind all that veil of tough love, there is that he ultimately wanted the best for me. And, so that kind of relationship, where it's a little complicated. And, we try to remember the best memories instead of focusing too much on the negative things.
Right on.
Thanks for joining us in our discussion on Everything Begins and Ends at the Kentucky Club by Ben Saenz. Join us on our next episode as we continue this discussion. And if you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep.